I really appreciate the work the Friends group did to make this happen. And my friend Vicki Goucher-Griffin, who was sort of a catalyst for this also. And I'm so happy to have so many members of my family here tonight. It's not often that I get to read for my family. And so that's very special. And I'm glad to know that there are other people as well who are here and appreciate coming to readings and hearing authors read their own work, which is an important thing for writers. And so thank you to the Milford Town Library for allowing events like this and enthusiastically sponsoring them. What I'm going to do tonight, how's this microphone? Does it sound okay? Yes. Okay. What I'm going to do tonight is read a few different excerpts from my memoir, My Father's Eyes. This is what it looks like. There's a table in the back with lots of them. I'll be signing books after. That's me on the cover at 10 years old. I decided to do this book sometime after my dad died. Growing up, I thought my dad was, an interesting man, and he had a lot of challenges, and we all did as a family. And it wasn't until I left home and began to talk to, people about my father and the way I grew up that I realized he was so exceptional. And I felt that ought to be acknowledged after his death. And so I set about to write what I thought would be an autobiographical novel. And I spent 10 years doing that and then threw it away. And I realized that it was never going to work because I needed to tell the real story, or at least my version of the real story, because I'm sure there are people in my own family, my own siblings even, who have another version of the story. Because based on where you are in your birth order, whether you were the firstborn or the lastborn or whatever, you're going to have a different perspective on what went on in the family, because different events happen that are more important to you than they are to the other members of your family. So I'm going to read a section from a chapter called Eyes to start with, it will give you the main characters. And I think other than myself, and really this book is about me and how I became who I am, and what my dad had to do with that, what his situation had to do with that. Before, the two people other than me that are the most important in this story are my parents, my mother and my father. So the first section I'll read to you will be about them and the different places they came from, the different ethnicities, different classes, because that's very important to understanding how they responded to the situation when my dad found out he was losing his sight. So the way this book is structured is it's been described as being something like a novel by one of the writers who wrote a little blurb for the back cover. And I think what she means by that is that it covers two different periods in history, the 1950s and 60s, when I was growing up. And then there are chapters, and each of those chapters has a little title and a date, a year of the year or the approximation of the year. And then there are other chapters that are called Memorial Days, and those chapters all take place decades later, about 3 decades later, the week my dad died. And they're different days of the week during that time period. And they give the reader a sense of what happened to my dad and to each of the members of the family and in the world in the intervening years between the late 60s and 1993. So you go back and forth as you read this book with these two different plots, one of them being me growing up in this family in the 1950s and 60s, and then later the week my dad dies. So you see all of us as adults. And my father, at 70, has just died. So, all right, enough talking. We can, if you have questions after, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if you have any comments you want to make. And I'm now going to take off my glasses because I don't need them to read. And so I'm hoping you won't all be a blur, but I don't want to look like Bill Clinton and be like this. Okay, so this first section, I'm going to read 3 sections. I'll just stop briefly in between them. And then we can talk if you want to talk about it after. This one is called Eyes, 1947 to 1956. I picture my father, Biagio John Bonina, as a young man still in his 20s before the diagnosis of retinitis pigmentosa, a gradual degeneration of the retina leading to blindness. He is driving through small towns in Massachusetts. Most of these towns are even smaller than his own of Milford, near the Rhode Island border. To get to Worcester, he follows Route 140 for 30 miles or so through Hopedale, Mendon, Upton, and on into Grafton, where the road meanders around Lake Ripple. He is not yet married, although that is the point of his traveling. He is looking for a wife. It is 1947. Route 140 North is a country road with only an occasional street light. He drives it often, so he knows it well. Most Friday and Saturday nights, he and his friend, Nove Marcone, head for the big city to go dancing. Now that the war is over, they are hoping to meet the women of their dreams. I know the fancy gowns and dresses my mother wore when she went out dancing. They were still in the closet in the back bedroom at my grandparents' house while I was growing up. I loved getting dressed in them and playing dance queen with my sister Peg, the two of us pretending that we were in one of the musical numbers in the old movies we watched on Sunday afternoons. My mother's dresses were made of satin and tulle. The gowns were black, white, emerald and Nile green, or deep red, a whole array of colors and styles. I found that wearing them was magical. I suppose I must have put on the same dress my mother wore the night she met my father, but she never did tell me which one it was. In recounting their meeting, she told me that he wouldn't take no for an answer when he asked her to dance. Dressed in a tailored suit cut from fine woolen fabric that hung just so on his slender frame, she thought he had panache, and that made him irresistible. She didn't know any Italians, not really. Yet he seemed familiar. Frank Sinatra came to mind. He could have put his shoes under her bed any day. Something about him reminded her of Frank Sinatra. The eyes of her new admirer were dark brown, not blue, but that didn't matter. When he looked at her, those dark eyes made her feel that he could see right through her. She calculated that he stood at about the same height as Sinatra, and he moved in that same suave way, except sometimes, and that troubled her. At a club or dance hall, he wouldn't always take her by the arm as they wove in and out around the tables on their way to and from the dance floor. He fell behind, following her instead of leading the way. It was as if she were a guide, blazing a trail for them. She wasn't used to being with a man who acted like that, not after going dancing with others who proudly took her arm. Why couldn't he show her common courtesy? If he didn't have that, she considered, then what good was it to be so handsome? She asked herself, what kind of people are these Italians anyway? She demanded an explanation. Why was he always waiting for her to cut a path through the crowd? She had no intention of letting him go on that way, always lurking in the background whenever they were out in public. It was as if he were afraid of his own shadow. She put it to him finally. Don't you know how to act when you're out in public with a woman? It's my eyes, he told her. A doctor had given him glasses for the problem, and he wore them, although they didn't seem to help much. That's all it is, Mary, he told her. And don't you know there isn't another woman I know as beautiful as you are? He explained to her that his eyes gave him the most trouble when he walked inside from a dark parking lot to a bright foyer, or when he walked out into the blackness of night when they were heading home. That is the reason, he said, he had her take the lead. And when the lights in the dance hall were dim, and they usually were, he knew he might stumble if he did not have his hand on her elbow, nudging her ahead of him. She thought about his problem only briefly. So what? Lots of people wore glasses, she thought. His explanation put to rest the uneasiness she had been feeling about what she'd perceived as inconsideration. She was not thinking clearly, she would tell you now. She must have already fallen for him. She thought that there would be a simple solution. A new doctor, new glasses. She couldn't have understood the serious implications for him, for her, and for their future children. He had no idea himself. We never know what lies ahead for us, but I think that my mother knew less than many of us do about life. When I was growing up, she freely admitted time and again that she was a bit naive, telling one story or another from her youth to illustrate how innocent she was. Always, whenever she repeated this one about how she met my father, she would say, "Boy, was I green." She was a blue baby, my grandmother so often proclaimed about talking about my mother, referring to the oxygen deprivation she'd experienced during birth. She might have died, which is the reason everyone was good to her. Because of all the attention she received, her younger sister, my Aunt Margaret, used to call her Queenie. As a child myself, not knowing what my grandmother meant when she talked like that, not understanding that her baby, my mother, was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck and nearly suffocated, I would try to picture what my mother must have looked like at birth. I sometimes stared at her baby picture displayed atop the piano at Graham's house, and I tried to visualize her face in turquoise, azure, and sometimes dark blue. Did her troubled arrival in this world make my mother the darling of her grandmother's proper residence on Jakes Avenue, a 3-story brick house dating from Victorian times, like the family living in it? Her mother's 2 sisters, her aunts Mary McCarthy, who was a school teacher, and Margaret O'Brien, a nurse, as well as their brother, her Uncle Tom, and his family, all lived at Jakes Avenue. My mother was such a frequent visitor that it was a second home to her. Dr. Tom, as he was called, was one of the city's most prominent obstetricians, and he took a great interest in my mother's well-being. My grandmother would tell the story of my mother being blue at birth whenever she was melancholy, routinely remembering my mother's birth right after telling of how she had lost her only son, David, just a day or so after a man had come to the house begging for food. It was just before the Great Depression, and this man came often. She would generally help him. As the story went that day in question, she had not exactly refused him. She would have fed him, except that she was busy with baby David. When she told that man that she couldn't help him right away, he got angry and he cursed her baby too, and then her baby died. When I was old enough, my grandmother asked me to memorize a poem that must have reminded her of her dead son. The poem described a child's toys dusty and rusting on a shelf, never seeing use, still waiting for the boy who was meant to play with them. I memorized the poem because she wanted me to do so, and I recited it for her whenever she asked me for it. "Do it to please me," she would say. It was a poem in a collection by Eugene Field. I became accomplished at reciting the lines on command for company and sometimes for her alone, even though I could tell that it made her sad. "The little toy dog is covered with dust, but sturdy and staunch he stands. The little toy soldier is red with rust, and his musket molds in his hands." Again and again over the years, she'd say, "Recite it now, will ye?" The Irish have a way of never forgetting tragedy. It is their history, no doubt, that has ingrained this aspect of personality in them. So when misfortune hits them dead center, the way it did my grandmother, and my mother too, they live for it, for the telling of it, and the loss lives in them for the rest of their days. I suppose since I am descended from them on my mother's side, I have a trace of that characteristic myself. Why else would I tell this story? My father couldn't stay away from her, my mother says. He kept showing up at all the dance halls. No matter which one she went to, he was there. At Norumbega Park, the Indian Ranch, and Club Cosmo. And then he began asking if he could visit her at home. She said no to that too. A lot of difference it made. Her assessment, he was so damn stubborn. He always was that, but it served him well when he went blind. Once she let him in the door, he began driving to the city to visit her 2 and 3 times a week. Finally, she thought, oh, might as well let nature take its course. This is the closest my mother ever came to admitting to me that she loved my father. But she must have. She stayed with him, pushed him to face his denial, and to get the help he needed. My father owned the Packard at the time he began courting my mother, having traded in his 1938 Dodge, which had been famous in his hometown. This is a story my Uncle Tom told me. Once, I should say thank you to everyone who told me stories for this book. Once when someone had given him a calf, he put it in the back seat of the old car and drove it home. When my father was not allowed to keep the animal, he showed the kind of resourcefulness that would later help keep the wolf from the door of our family's house. He held a raffle to find a home for the baby cow, releasing it to a farm in Blackstone. When he was growing up, my father's family had chickens, a large vegetable garden, and a simple white house that was bursting at the seams with family. Anna was born ahead of him, as well as 2 boys who died as infants of influenza, and born after him were Marguerite, Evelyn, Jean, and Tom, who looked enough like him to have been his twin. In addition to the 8 children born to Bologna and his father Biagio, for whom he was named, the house also sheltered his grandparents, his mother's mother and father, Gaetano and Marguerite. On the street level of the house was Testa's, the family market. My father was the only one of the 6 children in the family to leave Milford permanently and establish his home in another place. It was a bold move for the oldest son born into an Italian immigrant family to move to the city and leave that small town in which even unrelated families became an extension of your own. What must have required a greater courage, though, was not marrying a woman who was not like anyone else he knew, not Italian, but Irish, and from educated people. We were refined, don't you forget that, my mother would always say, referring to her own upbringing. She reminded us of this fact whenever the issue of etiquette or acceptable behavior surfaced in our family. She chastised us this way, too, if we complained of being slighted or scorned by other children in our parochial world. Once my father's eyes changed, not for the better, and as a consequence, our financial circumstances did as well. Through it all, my mother refused to accept that marrying my father and living as we did changed anything about her. After all, she had an uncle who was a well-known doctor, unmarried aunts who were teachers, nuns, and nurses, and one of her uncles wrote poetry, and another was a Catholic missionary priest of the Passionist order who'd made their union official, marrying my parents in a formal ceremony in Worcester at St. Paul's Cathedral, then heading to his post in Jamaica, West Indies, where he later built a school. My father had learned the trade of machine tool making after leaving high school without finishing up, frustrated by the problem with his eyes. During the war, unable to serve because of his bad eyes, he worked as a tool maker in the Charlestown Navy Yard. He saved his money and he bought a Packard to get him where he wanted to go. Years before he met my mother, my father had begun to experience night blindness. Somehow that did not keep him from pursuing her, which meant driving the 30 miles or so from Milford to Worcester and back again in the dark, negotiating the curves and bends in the road that followed Lake Ripple, just to take my mother dancing. I have always thought that there was something magical about my father's ability to navigate in the dark. Knowing that he did this, that he drove a car to Worcester as often as he did to see my mother, and knowing that he traveled mostly at night when his eyes were least reliable, I cannot help but wonder how he could have found his way except for love. My parents married a year after they'd met. I have a photograph of my mother dressed in her going-away suit, and she is wearing sensible shoes all ready for their honeymoon road trip to Canada in the Packard. My mother descending the front steps of her family home, being showered with confetti by her sisters Margaret and Sally. Almost 2.5 years after that June wedding day, I was born in November of 1950. So that's the first section I'm going to read for you. And I have some photographs which I'll show you when I'm finished. And there's one of my mother coming down the stairs. Generally, all 15 grandchildren were present, and 2 sets of grandparents, 5 aunts and 4 uncles, at least 1 granduncle, and my mother and father. All of us were crowded into the small upstairs apartment in what looked like an old farmhouse. We had a party every week, or so it seemed to me then. We children played outside in the yard, or sometimes at the playground up the street. We were left pretty much alone, and we liked that. If the weather kept us inside, some of those afternoons, the uncle, with the loudest voice or most serious demeanor, usually Uncle Ed or Uncle John, would be sent out as messenger from the living room where the adults gathered. That uncle would enter our world, take us by surprise, coming into what was called the TV room, the little den off the kitchen, to alert us to the fact that we were too loud or jumping around too much. Not in the house, he would say, and we all knew that he meant that we were expected to follow certain rules of behavior. Settle down now, he bellowed from the doorway, his face expressionless, and like toys that had been wound up to run and tumble for a limited time only, our activity ceased. However, being children, we would start up again almost immediately after he left the room. It took little more than a giggle from a silly cousin or an elbow jab from a teasing one. Except for my uncle visiting us once in a while to lay down the law, the adults stayed in the living room. Whenever there was a lull in our activity, we heard what seemed to be all of them talking at once. I wonder now what they talked about and whether they were really arguing. It did sound that way, and it still does whenever my Italian relatives get together, and I participate in that myself. I wonder, too, if they ever discussed my father's eyes at those Sunday afternoon gatherings, and whether my mother was sometimes rebuffed for trying to explain that his problem was hereditary, whether she actually did bite her tongue instead, as she so often remarked she had to do being with my father's family. Of all the wonderful surprises that came from those Sunday afternoons, the food, the sweets, the information we garnered from more worldly cousins, in retrospect, the one thing that stands out for me is the fact that my Irish grandmother and grandfather often came along for the ride. That is the way my grandmother put it. My Worcester grandparents, city people, and Victorian in demeanor, seemed to love being in the midst of that small-town Sicilian family. I recall that no one in my father's family ever called my Irish grandmother Julia or by her nickname Lulie, and no one called my grandfather Dave. Grandma Bella would say, "Mrs. Feary, would you like a cookie or a piece of cake?" And when my grandmother teased my grandfather for starting to doze off, she said, "Mr. Feary, another cup of coffee for you?" Sometimes my Sicilian grandfather didn't come home until late, so I didn't see him for very long in those afternoons. I knew only a few things about him because he didn't talk much to me, not knowing English very well. On Sundays, when he was not at the house, he was usually at the Sons of Italy. "He's a nice man, your grandfather," my mother would say about him. She got a kick out of his accent and appreciated the trouble he went to be understood. He was nice, taking me with him sometimes into his big garden to help him pick vegetables, letting me pull up carrots so that I knew what it felt like to tug at their hairy roots. He led me up and down the garden rows, reaching into his jacket for a salt shaker he kept there to use whenever we wanted to snack on the bright red and juicy tomatoes that were hot from the sun. My grandpa was always reaching into his pockets for something, coins for our piggy banks, chocolate bars, and every Sunday evening, after we piled into our car for the ride home to Worcester, he reached his arm in the back seat window and passed out small bags of Blackstone Valley potato chips to keep us happy during the ride home. Uncle Turi, who owned the gasoline station up the street where we stopped to fill the gas tank before heading home on Sunday evenings, was my grandmother's brother who lived downstairs with their other brother, Uncle Pete. Uncle Turi's sons, Bobby and Tom, lived with them. I didn't really know my Uncle Turi, but he had the thickest black eyebrows I have ever seen, and they danced around when he talked. My Uncle Pete had a business delivering chicken feed. A tin sign advertising Unity Feeds was nailed to the side of the small chicken house on the property, and it remained all the years I went there as a child. It seemed to me now that Unity Feeds was the family emblem. When I stayed sometimes at my grandparents' house during summer vacations, Uncle Pete took me with him on his route through small towns with fields and farmhouses to Mendon and Hopedale, Upton and Bellingham. I didn't know him very well either, and sometimes when he left me sitting alone in the red Ford pickup truck while he took an order or dropped one off and collected what he was owed, I worried that he might not return, and I wondered, what'll I do if that happens? But I swallowed my fear and went with him anyway for the adventure of doing something I had never done before. When we sat down to eat, the small kitchen was usually steamy from soup cooking in a large pot on the stove. Tiny beads of pasta, pastina, no bigger than nonpareils really, with bite-sized meatballs floating in a seasoned broth called Italian wedding soup because it was usually the first course at the celebration dinner. We all loved my grandmother's soup, and she knew it, smiling over us, passing around a small bowl of grated Parmesan cheese to sprinkle on top. A few would politely decline liking the soup without it. No thanks. I would try almost anything though, especially with my father's encouragement. I watched him freely spoon the cheese over his bowl. Put some on mine, I'd tell my grandmother. I loved the salty taste of the cheese and the way the hot soup made it melt in my mouth. More, she would always ask when we said we had finished eating. We could always have more. The children ate first, one family at a time, my grandmother serving and generally one of the aunts helping her. Each family of cousins took a turn at the table. Sometimes we were first and the others had to wait in the den until we finished. We could hear them tickling and teasing each other, rolling off the couch until they were called to eat. If we ate first, we waited outside for the rest to finish, ready for a game of Red Rover. My father was the only adult who sat with his children, I believe. I expect that the soup was made and served to us the same way it had been offered to him when he was a child by his grandmother. My father became his mother's son again on the afternoons of those weekly visits. One day a week he belonged to Milford. He would hold the spoon level with his mouth, stopping it in midair before taking it in so that he could inhale the fragrant steam. Mmm, he'd sing, getting the aroma and anticipating the delicious taste. My father cherished simple things like good soup. After we ate, we knew there were cookies and cakes. Every Sunday, I heard the aunties making plans to bake again during the week. We eyed the trays wrapped up on the side counter in the kitchen, had come to expect them. Get away from that counter, my Aunt Ev would holler, seeing us approaching before dinner. After you eat. There were anisette-flavored cookies, chocolate walnut drops frosted in cocoa butter ice cream icing, and vanilla ones with lemon frosting. All the cousins coveted the chocolate ones, so there were dozens of them. There were my father's favorites, which had a thick crust of toasted sesame seeds coating them, vanilla fingers that had a somewhat dry consistency and even more anisette flavoring than the others. Any seed cookies, my father would ask, meaning the sesame ones. His favorites were always there, and I passed them to him. I liked the bow ties of light fried dough, which were sprinkled with powdered sugar and had the slightest taste of oranges and almonds. There were also miniature cheesecakes and something called red velvet cake, which was burgundy red inside but tasted like chocolate. My neighbor knows the pastry chef at a New York restaurant that's famous for that kind of cake. That's where the recipe comes from, my Aunt Anna said proudly. All of this food served simply because it was Sunday, and on Sunday the family visited. When she wasn't serving us, my grandmother stood next to the stove watching the other things that were cooking: roasted potatoes, macaroni and gravy, and sometimes braciole, bacala, salted cod and tomato sauce, roast chicken, or a leg of lamb in the oven. In Milford, with my father's family, in addition to the band of cousins to run with after eating all that food, we had my grandmother's stories. She liked to tell us about what life was like for her as a young girl. I remember only one of her stories in any detail. When I was little, she began, we didn't have a library to go to. How could you read any books then, I asked. Many people bought or rented books from peddlers, she explained. She settled me on the floor at her feet. She dramatized all the answers to my questions. Let me tell you, she said. She gently, almost inaudibly, clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth, the way she would when she was beginning her story, or whenever there was a pause in the action and the scene was about to change. This wasn't a tick, but it was more like punctuation. When she did this, I knew that she had a good story to tell. It was a nearly imperceptible sound, but my sisters and brother, my cousins and I all waited for it after she would begin. I'd wait all day when I knew the peddler was coming, she said. The room was perfectly silent as we waited to hear her strange story of the way she would get books. When she told the story, I used to picture her jumping down to the bottom landing of her back hall stairs, a little girl of 10, like me. Hurry, before she goes, my mother called out to me from the upstairs doorway. When my grandmother brought the books back from the peddler, she read them aloud, first in English, and then she translated them into her mother's Sicilian dialect for her. My grandmother read for her mother. I would read for my father. From the time I was very young as 10, I believe, I read bills and business letters for him, and sometimes the mixing instructions on the huge bag of Portland cement. When I read the gauge on the boiler, I thought, am I doing it wrong? I grew afraid of fire or a flood or some other kind of trouble coming to our house. I learned to read the fuse box whenever the electricity went out, because the wiring in our house was outdated. The fuses would blow because circuits were easily overloaded with too many appliances running at once in our apartment and the ones above and below us. I would climb down the cellar stairs into the pitch black with my father. If he were home when this situation arose, the two of us lost in the dark. The leaves on the weed trees growing close to the foundation at the windows would have blocked out any daylight that might have been left. Whether at dusk or later at night in the darkest reaches of the house, I helped find the source of trouble. Over here, my father used to direct me. This wall, he'd say, feeling for the metal box and finding it, swinging open its door, checking by touch to see if all the glass cylinders were in place. Then he'd shine a flashlight he had with him, for me. I could see. I read the darkness, the sign that one of the fuses was burned out. They mustn't have light downstairs either, my father said once about the tenant's apartment. That one that's blown is the main fuse. It feeds the whole house. I had not realized that night that my father didn't know that there wasn't any light at all in the back hall, not even a little seeping out through the keyhole of the apartment or underneath the kitchen door as we passed by on our way to the cellar. He had kept the flashlight in his pocket until we were at the fuse box. I learned along with him how to get by in the dark. My father unscrewed the old fuse and put it into his pocket each time I identified a spent one. Then he would replace it with a new one. The rooms of the house that had been in utter darkness would light up again. Cousins were wonderful, I would think, once it got dark and my mother began the 40-minute or so drive back home to the city from Milford, cruising along in the Mercury past Lake Ripple. It was the same road my father had driven years before when he went to the city to take her out dancing. For the first 5 miles or so out of Milford, I felt I had no worries. An afternoon of laughing and playing hard had left me carefree. Having cousins was a lot like having friends. Peg and I laughed louder than usual, both of us overtired, recalling silly things that had happened to us during the afternoon. My mother and father put up with our silliness until we got out of control, laughing so hard that the radio playing Frank Sinatra singing Blue Moon, a song my father liked so much, could hardly be heard above our laughter. My father had been singing along with it and had to stop to reprimand us. Both he and my mother eventually lost patience when we got like this in the car. The chickens got out of their coop one afternoon and they went running in my grandfather's garden. It took the effort of all the cousins to herd them out of the rows of tomatoes and down the path back to their little house. How did they get out? My father wanted to know when we reported the event. They walked out, I said. This set me off, and Peg too. We laughed even more at the idea of chickens walking rather than scooting as they do. I mean, my father said, mad at my wisecrack, who let them out? When we finally stopped laughing about the chickens and it was quiet, except for the static of the lost radio station, I related what I thought was the funniest thing that had happened that afternoon. It was difficult to tell it. I was laughing so hard. No cousin was ever left out. We played games that didn't require much skill so that everyone could be included, regardless of our different ages. Well, first we played hide and seek, then we played Red Rover. Didn't I tell you not to play that Red Rover game before someone breaks her neck, my mother said. She thought the older boys played roughly. Yes, you did, I answered. Anyway, while we were playing Red Rover, someone said, where's Jeff? We didn't see him, so we gave up the game and we all went in different directions looking for him. Jeff was one of the younger cousins playing that afternoon. Dear blessed God in heaven, my mother said. We did find him, but he was lost for a while. Well, where was he, my father wanted to know. Guess, I said. Oh, come on now, get on with it, my mother said. No, guess, I said. So tell me, my father said, where was Jeff anyway? Stuck on hide and seek, I told him. Peg started laughing hysterically, yelping, really. He was sitting in the backyard next door in the garden on a stone bench near the flowers, just waiting for us to find him. We couldn't see him from where we were. Didn't anyone yell, Didn't anyone yell, Ollie, Ollie, I'm free, my father? Peg and I laughed heartily hearing my father say that, Ollie, Ollie, I'm free. One night, one of our stories had distracted my mother. She almost missed a red light as we entered the center of Grafton. She slammed on the brake and I hit my head against the window. See, she said, one of these days you kids will cause an accident. Somehow, Kate and Jack slept through all of this. The motion of the car would conk them out by the time we were just a few miles out of Milford. Enough, my father said. Sit back now before you get hurt. Sunday was over. He began one of his talks. It was always the same things he talked about when we were trapped in the car with him, and he made the most of it, going on and on the rest of the ride home. The 12 or however many miles we had left to go. He was a good talker. I could tell that he meant what he said, that it came straight from his heart. You kids don't know how lucky you are, he'd say, starting out. We do, Peg and I would say in unison, hoping that if we agreed with him, he wouldn't go on with his lecture. But we meant it too. On Sundays, we really did feel lucky. Have you ever considered all you have in life, he'd ask us. We knew he didn't want us to answer him, that he wanted to list everything for us, to recount all the things we had that he didn't have when he was growing up. Even if we did say what we were thinking, as we had tried one time when he'd given this talk, even if we went on to list every good thing we could remember, every gift we'd ever been given, he would, we knew, find more that we had not realized. He was trying, he would say, to make an impression on us. From the speeches he gave us those nights, I was left with the message that everything good could be taken away, and without any warning. I think now that my father was also lamenting the loss of his former life, of leaving Milford, not having his large family all around him. If he ever thought of moving back, though, he never said so. There, he wouldn't have had the opportunities he had, and surely he must have known that. Going back each week must have given my father something to push against. Our trips were a constant reminder of the life he might have lost had he stayed. Taking us to Milford each week was a way for him to gauge his progress, to measure just how far he had come from that world. He was showing them as well that he was proud to be raising his children to be curious about the wider world, to want to know things. We'd hear an aunt gasp when one of us used what she thought was a 50-cent word, or if we explained something we'd learned that she didn't know about, or when we talked about a museum or concert we'd been to with our grandfather. We wouldn't understand their surprise when they'd say, "Maroon, this one's so smart." But without those visits, I would have been limited as well, thinking of my reaction to those comments. I would shrug, though, hearing them not knowing what was meant, thinking, "That's not smart, doesn't everyone know that?" Yes, by taking us there, he showed us, too, the same thing that his speeches were meant to teach us, that we were never to take for granted what we had. "With all you have," my father said in the car on those rides home from Milford, "you should be the best in everything." I wondered then if he meant that being the best was a way of keeping what you had from going away. He repeated those words like a refrain after each new thing he talked about. With all you have, you should be the best in everything. So, there's just one short, much shorter than those two piece that I want to read from the Memorial Day sections, which, as I said, those are the ones from 1993, the week my father died. And this happens on the day. It's kind of a flashback. It's a memory that's jogged on the day that I go to pick up my father's personal effects at Mass General Hospital. He died at work, which, if you knew my father, you'd know that made perfect sense. He never stopped working. So I went to the hospital with a friend, and while I was there, this memory came back to me, and so I put it in that chapter that describes that day, and it's just a few pages, and it takes place in Boston in 1990, I think. I knew the train was coming into the station by the difference I heard in sound as the conductor began to brake. I knew it was time to get off, registering it unconsciously, and I stood up. I was the first in our car on my feet, heading to the door, even though the train was still in the tunnel. Then I was first off the train, meeting the 5 o'clock rush hour crowd head on, pushing my way past the knot of old people, school kids, and suits who edged up to the door to enter the train. I hustled, weaving in and out and around people to get to the stairway leading to the lower platform to make my red line connection. I flew down the stairs, jumping the last two. I avoided the obstacle course of musicians in their instrument cases full of spare change and recordings for sale. The stairway ended at the open first car of the train. I saw the conductor sticking his head out of his compartment, ready to close the door, and I was in before he did on my way to Central Square. When I looked up, I saw my father. He was standing right in front of me, the last person I would have expected to meet by chance on the train. What were the odds of it? He spooked me. "Well, hello," I said. Of course, he knew my voice. "Ree," he smiled as if he'd been expecting me. He was coming from work that evening on the train headed over the Charles River on Longfellow Bridge from Boston into Cambridge, being at the time the operator of the Harbor Mist Cafeteria, which served the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters building on the Northern Avenue waterfront. Those who worked there and in other waterfront businesses, salesmen making their rounds, mail carriers, occasionally tourists as well, ate breakfast and lunch or had coffee or snack at my dad's cafeteria. Calling it that name, Harbor Mist, was his idea, for the fact of its location and the sometimes damp and foggy coastal weather, and of course, for the fact of his own blindness. When I'd call him on the phone there, he would answer, "Harbor mist, pea soup here." "There's a seat behind you. Why don't you sit?" I said when the train gave a jolt. I suspected I was not the first person to have offered him a seat, since he'd boarded one stop before at South Station. Realizing that he was blind, seeing his cane, people were generally willing to give up their seats on a rush hour train, but he politely declined. "I'm fine, I'll stand, you sit." "Nah, I don't want to sit, you sit," he said, resisting my offer as well. "No, that's okay, I'm fine." I would have loved to sit, but I wanted to talk to him more than I wanted to sit, and if I sat down, it would have separated us. He was happy when we talked, and I enjoyed talking with him as well. I was tired after teaching, but I wasn't on my way home yet. I was going to my night job. I was hungry, I was pregnant, but I knew that my father had awakened at 4 a.m., and I knew he rarely sat down all day. He was not in the best of health and was nearly 30 years older than I was. But he looked well, strong, and you'd think healthy, though a little tired. He wasn't going home to Worcester, to a good dinner, a wife, and a comfortable home until the weekend. He was headed to a room at the Cambridge Y, his home during the work week. My mother didn't want to move. "Where did you get those duds?" I teased him. I was talking too loudly. A very proper-looking woman gave me the eye. I was insulting a blind man, she thought, probably. She knew he was blind because he was carrying a scratched and dented metal cane which he held like a shepherd's staff. "What do you mean?" my father asked, his eyes feigning ignorance. "What you're wearing," I said, losing patience. "What do you mean, what I'm wearing?" He looked defiant then, rather than perplexed. He knew full well what was wrong with what he was wearing. It was a costume he had on, a disguise. What people saw of my father on a rush-hour train was the way he survived in the big city. He looked as if he were wearing clothes that came straight out of the laundry bag, unironed clothes. His charcoal gray pants were some kind of wool and a synthetic blend, and their rough surface gave the impression that the slacks had been washed instead of dry cleaned. "You have good clothes," I said. "What are you doing dressing like this in public?" "Do you know what I paid for these pants when I bought them? These pants are from Shaq's," he said, referring to a men's clothing store in Worcester. "And this is an Arrow shirt I've got on," he smirked. "They've seen better days," I said. The people sitting along the train bench facing us looked uncomfortable. I could tell they were as they looked up at us, hovering above them and talking. Hearing our conversation, they resettled themselves in their seats after exchanging glances and raised eyebrows. They didn't know he was my father. What did they think? They saw me as a professional, I suppose. I could have been a lawyer, dressed as I was. Nice suit, good shoes, and coach bag. My brother Jack once told me that I looked like I worked for IBM when he met me for dinner one day after work. I was a writer then too, but I had a day job as a corporate trainer, one who taught English to medical and bank employees. I had a night job too, creating a program to help adults to learn to read and write, and I was headed there on that train. I watched the other passengers watching my father and me. I had watched people watch us my whole life. Seeing us on the train together that evening, did they think that I was a lawyer harassing a homeless blind man? "So what have you got in the bag anyway?" I asked quieter and more politely. My father had the brown, wrinkled, and crumpled shopping bag rolled up and tucked under his arm. I knew what was in the bag, although no one on the train would have guessed. I was provoking him, a low blow, I knew. He was secretly afraid that someone would find out that the bag was stuffed with cash. I hadn't meant to scare him. I just wanted him to stop taking the risk. That's why I confronted him. Still, that he carried money that way, in this day and age, as my mother would have said, was comical. And he knew it. We shared the joke. "My snacks," he said, smiling impishly. "Peggy Lawton's." He was He was referring to the brownies he sold at his cafeteria. He wanted everyone on the train to think that it was his lunch he had in the bag. He was carting the cash proceeds from his restaurant, his day's earnings, back and forth on the train. And on Fridays, he took the whole week's receipts home, stuffed in his suitcase on the Peter Pan bus from Boston to Worcester. He would have rather been a hero, lose his money being robbed at gunpoint, than have had to pay someone to make bank deposits and still have to worry about whether he was being taken advantage of or not. He didn't have time to go to the bank himself, he said, so he carried a big lunch instead. My father's concern with money wasn't greed. The only fear he seemed to have kept alive all the years from the time he was certain that he was losing his sight some 40 years before was the worry that he wouldn't be able to provide for the care of his family and his own simple needs. He wanted next to nothing for himself: good, comfortable shoes, a Sunday suit with clean shirts, and an occasional meal at a nice restaurant to celebrate a family event or a birthday. And if going in disguise, looking destitute, was what he had to do to make sure he had those things, so be it. He put his pride in his pocket, he said. It was his little joke on the world of the sighted. My father and I were the first to move toward the door as the train approached Central Square Station. We had both heard it, the change in sound, registering it unconsciously and automatically as always. Neither of us needed to see where we were. We simply reached out and grabbed the metal pole just as we were about to feel the jolt as the train braked. We knew it signaled our arrival. We knew where we were at all times. My father gently took my arm, his left hand on my right elbow, like a key that moved me forward, propelled us both up the stairs and outside to the street. Fini.